Hey, Miguel Iturrate back here on the Cage Rage podcast, and we have a very special live edition here. I'm joined by Johnathan Ivey. It's his second trip to the CRP. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing great this morning, Miguel.
Great for joining us. Now, where are you right now? You're in Tennessee?
Nashville, Tennessee, man. Yep.
Lovely,
Good old
Nashville,
Middle Tennessee.
Yep, I love Nashville, and get some dried smoked ribs or something like that going. Jonathan is a MMA veteran that is really from the old school. He's been in the sport 22 years, and I just want to do an interview with him about that, about the changes in MMA, and about really just go through some old stories on the old school. I was fortunate enough to be the matchmaker, I guess, that discovered Jonathan, or where Jonathan made his debut, and we were talking about that, Jonathan. So let's go over this deal here. It's like July of 1997, I believe. And
98. August of 98, Miguel. You're getting old.
Okay, well, I think July of 97 was my first show, and that's why I got confused, right?
I got you.
So now all of a sudden, I've been working at Hook and Shoot for a year, and we got guys like John Rankin, who you were later associated with and stuff. But in the really early days, we had a bodybuilder guy named Tommy Graham, who was our heavyweight champion. And it was with Tommy that you came into that first show. Why don't you tell people how you met Tommy and how crazy those early days were?
It was a Wednesday night at the gym that I worked out at. They were holding a bench press contest, and I won the bench press contest. That was always kind of my thing back then. And afterwards, the owner of the gym introduced me to Tommy Graham, and Tommy said, "You should be fighting professionally." I didn't know what MMA or NHB was on that Wednesday night. There was a kickboxing gym 2 doors down that Tommy worked out at. He walked me 2 doors down, Miguel, and he took about 10 minutes and he showed me a key lock and a guillotine choke, right? He said, "You're ready, Ivy," after 10 minutes. And so 2 days later, he asked me to drive to Evansville to watch an event that he had won a 4-man tournament at previously. And we get there to watch, and then they have a 4-man tournament that night. One of the guys don't show up. So Tommy walks over and says, "Hey, they want to know if you'll fill in. Your first fight will be against Sam Smith." Back then, I was undefeated in the street, so I thought it would be the exact same. So I said, "Yeah, I'll beat these guys up." So I fought Sam Smith. I had to use that guillotine I learned 2 days earlier, and then I made it to the finals and had to fight a really tall kickboxer, and I just ran out of gas, and he made me look silly. But that's how it all started, 2 days of knowing what MMA was.
And that's the kind of crazy stuff that, just doesn't go down anymore. I mean, in general, I think even small promoters nowadays are going to avoid that. Like, hey, you're going to fill in and stuff. Like, I mean, it's 1998, Jonathan. I'm going to guess you didn't have your medicals with you, did you?
There was no medicals. I had on basketball shorts, and I borrowed a mouthpiece that Tommy had in the trunk that was unformed. So okay, it was, yeah.
Man, borrowing a mouthpiece. I'll tell you, you want to hear an old school story, man? We did a show down here in Costa Rica, and these guys came up here from Panama, and they screwed up, and they didn't bring a cup. None of them bought a cup. These motherfuckers shared a cup. I was like, oh, well, God. But a mouthpiece might be worse.
Hey, here's a disgusting story. I fought in the IVC in Caracas, Venezuela, and I get over there, and they had like some maids in the locker rooms for some reason. Well, I set my mouthpiece down. The maid threw it away. So this is before my fight that night. So I have to borrow a used mouthpiece from some guy from Canada that was fighting. And so I fought in the IVC with a used mouthpiece. And thank God he didn't have any HIV or anything, because I'm clean as a whistle. But the old days.
Yeah, I remember that IVC in Venezuela. That was one that that veteran Alex Steibling won. Another boy from your neck of the woods, right? He's from Kentucky.
Yeah, Alex Steibling won a 16-man tournament.
Yep, and Venezuela is a rough place to be back then. Now it's gotten even worse, but that's got to be some cool experience. We'll get into some of that, because by the time you made Venezuela, you were already, kind of a known quantity. A big heavyweight who'd fought all over the place in the United States, and you got some good high profile shows. But let's go ahead and talk about that. So we're in this warehouse in Indiana, and you're going to meet Sam Smith. Now, Sam Smith is from Evansville, and he's a local police officer. And, you know, it's safe to say, and I know Sam well, a very nice guy. It's safe to say, though, that Sam had more than 10 minutes worth of training. So now you look back at it, how crazy is that to get in there? First of all, you know, knowing you a little bit and stuff, when you hear he's a cop, does that do anything to you too? Like, this is the old days, you know? Everybody had another job.
Right. Well, when I found out he was a cop, I was more excited about it, Miguel, because I'm going to get to hit this guy and not get charges pressed against me. But Sam ended up being a real nice guy. Him and his brother Mark. I talked to him back then. I was talking to him every show I would see him at. But I was so naive. You know, that weekend on Friday I did well, and then I got invited back Saturday and I did well. And I was telling people, look, I'm going to be the world champ of this sport in 6 months. I mean, it was just, I didn't realize there were levels to this. Right. And so, but yeah, man, it was a good start. That was a fun weekend. And I owe you a lot, you and Jeff both, a lot for putting me on.
Well, you know, at the point, and some of this is, you know, my normal answer because it happens, you know. But you're in the early days of the sport. You got a 4-man tournament with 3 guys showing up, and you got to thank guys like yourself, 2 pioneer dudes who would actually, you know, show up and be like, yeah, I'll do it, you know. And in many ways, those guys save the show, and I think that's also part of like what's your bread and butter too. You know what I mean? Because you bring the whole show when you do the fights and stuff. So now all of a sudden, you know, you need a Johnathan Ivey on your card to attract people who have all this stuff and things that. And in the early days, it had to do with like saving the day and stepping in on short notice, not knowing what you're doing. I'll tell you though, the first time you hit Sam, I still remember that sound because it was a big room, you know, like a warehouse room with a high roof, and the cameras were up on like a second roof there, and you know it was real ghetto. They're selling hot dogs and crap like that. You know, we're trying to get a little bit of money on the soda and stuff like that. And the sound of that slap just reverberated in that ring. And then the next day, I think you had another MMA fight. How did that work out? Because it was let's talk a little bit about the rules too, because we were experimenting. Those first rules were really slap fights. They were pancrase fights with open hand. And
right.
You know, to your credit as a street fighter kind of guy, adapting on very little notice, you were very I can say this for you, throughout my whole time with you, you were very conscious of staying with the rules, following the rules, and actually learning and stuff. And that was evident from the very beginning.
Yeah, well, there's a difference, Miguel, between an open hand palm strike, which a fighter would throw, and just an old pimp smack. And so I didn't know the difference. So I was just smacking Sam. If you go back and look at it, slapping him. But I was so naive. I just can't believe how naive I was. And I guess everybody, when they're getting involved in something new, they're that same way. But I had no idea what I was getting into, and it led to so much. But you're right. As far as taking fights on short notice, people say a bunch of people say things about my record, Miguel, but my record's the way it is for a reason. Taking fights on a day or two notice, is one thing. But when I found out that to sustain, the hardest thing in this sport is sustaining yourself or having longevity. That's what's the hardest thing. So to do that, right, I was going to have to take fights constantly. And in the year 2003, from January to December 2003, I had 26 professional fights in that 12-month span. So I had to constantly take fights, and I had to fight injured and things like that. So when I realized I wasn't going to be able to win all these fights, that's just not physically possible, when you're doing it that way. And I had to do it that way to keep myself out of trouble, because I've never been the type that would go work a 40-hour week job and things like that. So to stay out of trouble, I was taking all these fights to bring money in. Well, when I realized I wasn't going to win them all, Miguel, I had to come up with something. Well, my trademark ended up being I had to walk out in costumes. I had to do crazy things in the ring and make the crowd pop. And I had to be known for not tapping. Now, early in my career, I tapped because I didn't know any better. But then as promoters got to know, look, Ivey's not in the quick tap club. So they got to know we can rely on Ivey to make it a fight. fight anyway. So I started getting that reputation, and then even I would win some and I would lose some, but the promoters kept bringing me back because they knew they could count on me, one, to show up, and two, to make it a fight.
Yeah, and that's one thing I'll give credit for, because, you know, if you do look at the record and you make a judgment, you're selling, you know, people short, because first of all, like the idea of saving the show and the promoters are grateful and stuff like that, and then the idea of saying, look, you know, you live to fight another day. I took a loss and stuff like that, but the promoters are going to work with you again. So yeah, you got to come back and you got to do a show and you got to do your whole thing, right? Now, let me ask you a question. You said you started off at a bench press contest. What were you benching back then? What was a Johnathan Ivey bench? Were you in the 500-pound club, 600-pound? How strong were you? I know you were strong.
When I met Tommy Graham, I set an APA junior world record. Now, what junior means is you got to be 23 years old or younger. And the APA is not a huge federation, but it was a federation. And I set that with a 610 bench.
See, that's amazing. I remember when Jonathan showed up. Jonathan showed up in 1997. He looked kind of the same, but a lot less tattoos. But
right.
Still, you know, when you look at like I'll tell you the story. You watch these strongman contests and stuff, and you see like a guy, like they'll put a harness on him and he'll like move a plane or something like that. Jonathan could do that shit. If you needed a plane moved, you know, you could get Jonathan to move that, because that's how strong this guy was for sure. And you know, he's still strong that way. You know, that's part of your bread and butter, being strong and stuff like that. Now, how'd you get the Leglock Monster name? How'd that come up?
Well, how I got the nickname was Grappling Magazine. That used to be real popular. They ran an article on me, and they titled the article "The Leglock Monster." And so after that, everybody just called me the Leglock Monster. So Grappling Magazine gave me that nickname. But the Leglocks really came from after Tommy Graham and I started training. Then I got with John Rankin, and then I got with Jason Godsey, and then that led to Eve Edwards. I moved down to Texas and trained with Eve. But John Rankin really kind of, I never wrestled in high school. We didn't have wrestling in high school. So I had to learn how to submit guys from my back and how to, it ended up, I just gravitated towards the leg locks because I was always on bottom. And how can I get back before leg locks were cool? You know, I was playing the half guard game and trying to get to legs and things. But yeah, Grappling Magazine, I owe the Leglock Monster to.
Yeah, and I mean, you went as far as fighting. You know, you're a guy who could definitely say fought everybody and anybody. You know, you look at your resume, and I did this to you. You know, is you look at Ben Rothwell now. You know, and Ben is still ranked in the UFC. You know, he was a young man then, but this guy is just massive. And I remember that you fought him, and he's a guy that I think, you know, you were going to have a tough time, you know, beating, right? But I remember that fight because you came in 100% ready to compete. And I mean, you took some huge shots from him working on that, exactly that, a leg lock and stuff like that. And the crowd appreciated that fight. And after that, you know, I would have kept bringing you back. We'd already worked together for so long, you know, life goes on, but there's nothing, you never did anything on our fights, even in losses, where you should be ruled out as a competitor, you know, and that's something you can take to the bank. If you come in and you say, Jonathan, we're going to do a show, Jonathan will do the show for you. But if you're saying, look, this is serious, here's some money for the winner, you got to, you know, you guys got to go down and punch each other, you know, and do this for real. Jonathan's your man just all the same. And a lot of people would draw a line like that, you know, a lot of people will say like, oh, you know, it's too hardcore for me or whatever it is. So kudos, Jonathan. And say, I got some people making comments. Got to hit a cop without catching a charge. Ended up being a cool guy, that cop. Yeah. People are making comments and stuff. So yeah. So talk about that Ben Rothwell fight, because I remember that was in Massachusetts, and if I remember correctly, this would have been one of the first times that we actually ran into a boxing commission. Remember, if you remember that there was a boxing commission up there with legit, you know, state officials and badges, and, you know, people really checking up that you're not doing works and stuff like that. I mean, they put me through the ringer as a matchmaker too, because they were kind of scared. And I did a couple of shows up there, and they wound up being, you know, great shows too. So, but talk about that. Talk about that boxing commission, if you remember it, and because that would have been one of our. Because in Kentucky and you know, hook and shoot Indiana and stuff, we could do whatever we wanted. I was the
Right. Yeah. The Ben Rothwell fight, I owe that to you. You were the matchmaker. I believe I took that fight. I believe Ben was originally scheduled to fight another heavyweight. I was living with John Rankin at the time. We were roommates, and I think you contacted John, and John asked if I'd go up and do it. I think this was within like 5 days or something, and so I'll get to this later, but yeah, I went up and fought him. There was a miscommunication. I didn't know it was for a title or it was for a heavyweight. I mean, so I get up there and I'm talking to a reporter in my hotel room and he says it's at heavyweight for a title. Well, I said, I've got to be 265. So I get on the scale and I'm like 7 pounds over. And so I go in the bathroom, I get some trash bags, go in the bathroom. I end up making the weight. And then, but I had some disappointing fights at hook and shoot previous to that. And I really felt like I let you down, especially because you was the one. Like I had a fight with Slade Martin, Dana Couture, some really embarrassing things where I should have probably beat these guys and I didn't. What you didn't know back then is I was doing a lot of them drunk, Miguel. Like my friends would drive me to Evansville and we would be driving. While they were driving me up there, I'd be drinking. But then I ended up losing to Dana Couture.
If we're being honest, I gotta say some of the matchmaking was done drunk too.
So I lost some of those fights. I lost some of those fights that I should have won, and I felt bad for you because I really thought you were expecting more out of me. You give me the chance with Rothwell, and so with Rothwell, I said I'm going to go out there 100%, and I really felt like I was winning the fight, and I cut myself on his knee brace above my eye, and the commission before the fight said if we have to stop it and look at the cut twice, it's automatically we're going to stop it. And so they had to look at the cut twice, and so they stopped the fight. But afterwards, here's the biggie: is you pulled me aside. It was in one of those outer corridors of that stadium. You pulled me to the side, and you told me how impressed you were, and if even though I lost, if I keep fighting like that and really going for the win. But I remember that conversation, and I'm like, I left that conversation thinking, okay, Miguel's not mad at me. He's not disappointed in me. Because those Slade Martin and Dana Couture and George Allen fights, I just felt like I let you down, man.
Yeah, you had a little streak there where what happened is, you know, that's the 10 minutes catching up because you were still a baby in the sport. You know what I mean? And every one of those guys had more training than you and had a lot of time. Like George Allen was a little guy, a smaller guy out of Georgia, out of the Georgia area. But George could punch. You know what I mean? And it's like, and you're going to be big and strong. I don't remember how that fight exactly went down, but George Allen was a handful that I could put in with a man 50 pounds bigger than him. You know, that means something. You should be scared a little bit, you know, because so you did a lot of hard work. You fought Jeremy Horn in the early days. And to me, Jeremy Horn is like, you know, a superhero because, you know, when you go back to those early days, that guy, you know, that guy was like, he was like a young, like, I don't know, it was like Encyclopedia Brown. You remember those books, Encyclopedia Brown?
Yeah.
He was so smart and just, you know, analyzing everybody and fighting, and he would help out. He'd be like, hey, I just got out of the ring. I'll ref if you want. He would do stuff like that. So to me, you know, to fight Jeremy Horn, you were learning throughout all those fights.
Yeah, you know, Jeremy was there that weekend that I made my debut, and I remember somebody saying, hey, that's Jeremy Horn. And I looked over, and I didn't know who Jeremy Horn was. I didn't know who any fighters were. And he looked the exact opposite of what you would expect a badass to look like, right? And so, but he ended up being, Jeremy's phenomenal and was always a super cool guy. We would see each other's at different little small shows after we fought, and he was always real nice, man.
Yeah, I've never met a guy so down to earth, a guy who's so much, you know. I just hope he's happy, and I think he is happy. You know what I mean? He's doing his own thing in Utah. Wants to, you know, I think keep a low profile. You know, I think he could be a bigger star and stuff like that. But I don't think that's quite his personality. I think it showed because from those days he was very much a guy who would fight on your show and wind up helping you with the show. I remember him repping for us and doing stuff. You know, Like, did you remember Jerome Smith? Was he part of the group that you guys worked with? Because he came with John Rankin a couple of times. He was a military guy from the Georgia area.
Well, Jerome Smith was we were roommates.
Okay.
It was me and Jerome. Me and Jerome were living together in Clarksville, Tennessee, and then that's when I thought maybe you were disappointed in me because you called us one weekend and you said, "Hey, Frank Mir's going to come fight," and you offered to fight to Jerome instead of me. And I felt like Jerome should have maybe had a draw in that. I mean, it was real close, but yeah, when you gave it to Jerome instead of me, I was like, Miguel, I let him down, man.
No, managing a roster, especially in those days, I think that, matchmaking is that. The bottom line is anybody could say, hey, there would be a great fight if this guy fought that guy, but to actually make it happen in the ring and have the relationships and, if I got a fighter who's questioning himself, but still, 3 months later, I got to call you and ask you for a fight, we got to have at least the communication open. You know what I mean? So, Jerome, I remember Jerome was another one of those guys, definitely a good soldier from the early days. I remember after he fought Frank Mir, he said he was, he fought 10 minutes with Frank. Frank went to the UFC and finished everybody in like 2 minutes afterwards. So Jerome must have been thinking like, what the heck? You know what I mean? And I'll tell you, man, talk about old school stuff. And Jerome, like I said, a good soldier. I mean, there's some stories about Jerome. Like I heard he stole Dave Mone's car at some point too. But
Jerome was a strange cat, man. We were roommates, and we had gotten into it a couple of times and just personal stuff and training and everything. So I knew I could beat him up. I knew I was a better fighter. But back then, we didn't know who Frank Mir was. Nobody. I had never heard of Frank Mir. I think that was his first pro fight, maybe. Jerome, I cornered Jerome in that fight, and he did well.
Gotcha. Yeah. And Jerome helped break the ring down after that fight. I mean, that's old school because he was like, hey, man, throw me another $100, that kind of thing.
Right.
I mean, imagine. And I remember Frank Mir seeing him breaking down the ring, and he'd be like, God damn. I was like, and I looked at Frank, I was like, better not lose. Just goofing around. He's like, no, just keep me winning. I don't want to break down no rings, But in a way, that's a sign of respect because he looked at it. Frank was after that fight. He was satisfied. He had his win under his record. He would go on, obviously, to be a UFC champion. So, he had probably big dreams and stuff. He turns around, he sees the guy he just went 10 minutes with. Breaking down a ring is a physical, effort. I wouldn't do it after. I'm a fat, lazy matchmaker. I'm not a competitor. So I never broke down a ring. You know what I mean?
Right.
But for him to do it after a fight, that's crazy. And that's, a good idea of the mindset of some of the early athletes and stuff like that. So Jerome, shout out to Jerome. He's out there. He used to call me Mr. Miguel.
Yep. I haven't heard from Jerome in years.
Yeah.
I got curious. Yeah, I looked up his record. I got curious a couple years ago, and I looked at his record, and I seen he hadn't fought in a long time, and he had a rough streak going. But I hope he's okay, man, because he was a good-hearted guy,
Yep. Now, so let me go back to these old school things. So now, tell me a story. Now, on my show, we being open and stuff in the early days, medicals and things, but we always had an EMT there, and he was we had in the early days we had an excellent EMT that devoted a lot of time to it, and when we had a couple of knockouts and things like that, the guy was awesome in responding, and we were very careful, and I paid a couple of medical bills for guys and stuff when it came up and stuff, so we always tried to do the right thing, but you got to have some ghetto stories about showing up at a show and just being like, what's going on here? So and I know you fought anyway, but Go back to the old school and tell us one that comes to mind if you can.
Well, I mean, it was kind of like the Wild Wild West back then, Miguel. It was just kind of like a free-for-all. There was really no rules. And to be honest with you, there's pluses and minuses to the way it was then and the way it is now. I mean, I don't know which way I prefer. Now you got a lot of I've came in contact with a lot of state commissions where the people that are running the state commissions, don't have any idea what they're doing. I mean, it's just kind of a money making scheme. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but back then, yeah, man, it was kind of like the Wild West. There was a lot of shows with no doctors. I've had promoters skip out the back door and not pay me afterwards. It was just kind of like a free for all, and and this that's all well and good, but what I do hold them accountable for is a promoter would pop up, run a show, lose money, and then the results would never get posted or anything. And typically those were the smaller shows where I was fighting lesser competition. So I was getting wins, but it never got, now you pull me up on, MMA.tv and I look like a guy that's whatever I am on there, 50 and 50 or something.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. A lot of undocumented. Now, let me ask you a question. How did the IVC in Venezuela came up? Because if I remember correctly, the IVC out of Brazil, this was, the old school, no gloves, no, the little net at the bottom of the ring so that if you were on the ground, you couldn't fall out of the ring and stuff like that. And the IVC was rough. And their last show officially in MMA was in Venezuela because they were trying to get out of Brazil. The Brazilian economy wasn't doing well, and they weren't going to do any more shows in Brazil. And they actually had a young kid named Mauricio Neto who kind of ran the show and did the matchmaking and stuff like that. But how did that come about? Because that was a 16-man open weight tournament, wasn't it?
Right. That's exactly what it was. And at the time I was training with, before I had a daughter, right, I was kind of a nomad. I would go around from camp to camp and I'd spend, a year here, a year there. Well, at the time I was training with Jason Godsey up in Indianapolis with Alex Stiebling and Chris Lytle and Tony Ross and those guys. Daniel Bobish was supposed to be in that tournament. Well, he ended up, I think this was after 9/11 or something. Well, he wasn't going to end up, he pulled out. He wasn't going to do the tournament because of the airlines or people were scared to fly and things like that. So that's the reason.
You're talking about a fight. It was November 11th, 2001. So 2 months after that tragedy. So, yep.
Right.
And okay. So with Jason Godsey, you had an IVC veteran and those guys that fought down there a lot and stuff. So that makes sense. Now you fought a guy who now your careers are practically comparable, probably because you fought the Brazilian version of the guy that would show up and fight anybody, the guy who would fight on short notice and stuff. You fought the Pedro Octavio, which nobody's going to remember this guy, but this guy was tough and kind of crazy too. Tell me about how that whole IVC experience went down.
Well, I was in the back seat. They were driving me around. They said when we got to
let me interrupt you. One thing, just one point of reference: who the Pedro is for old MMA fans. The Pedro is the victim of Gary Goodridge's ball crushing at the IVC. If you remember, Gary Goodridge fought there and actually reached into a guy and took his cup out and crushed his balls. That was against the Pedro. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I agreed to do this 16-man tournament. So the promoter, is his name Sergio? What was his name, Miguel?
Bonarelli. Sergio Bonarelli.
So he's in the front seat and I'm in the back seat, and the brackets were not made yet. And I knew the likelihood of me going through a 16-man tournament with my gas tank that I had, right, was not good. So I knew I wanted to, in my head, it was like, okay, fight the biggest, baddest guy they got. Well, Pedro was the biggest guy of the 16 of us. So I told that guy, and I said, I want to fight the biggest guy you got. So that's why he paired me up with Pedro. And Pedro stomped me in the groin. I was laying down in guard, and he stood up and stomped me in the groin. So he really... Yeah, he liked the IVC rules, I guess. But... he wasn't able to continue in that one. After the fight, he said something was wrong with his eye, and so he didn't continue. But that's how that came about. I just said I wanted to fight the biggest guy, and he was the biggest one there.
Yeah, and that was actually the Pedro's last fight. And his MMA record, like if on the internet, comes out to about 30 fights. And let me tell you, no, there's a lot more to this guy, a lot more to where he came from as a fighter. in Brazil in the old school stuff. And he was a guy that had a level too. There were guys better than him and stuff. But you're talking about a guy who fought everyone. And, I don't know if you remember, but he would always come into the room and be like, looking around like with an attitude and stuff like that. So did you talk to him after the fight, before the fight and stuff? Were you able to approach it? Because I know that you, like, even with like Horn and guys like that, you fought, but you always learn something. You try to stay in touch and like you've been talking about, With that guy was like a cartoon character, because he would be mad at you before the fight and shit. Talk about that. Do you remember that? Did any of that come up?
Well, no, he didn't like me, Miguel. At the press conference before the show, they're wanting us to be the American team, and we're supposed to be the bad guys, I think. And so they said they get Tony Ross and those guys to say that we're going to win the title, right? One of us is going to take the belt. And so I remember the Pedro was staring daggers through me, right, this whole time, and I'm trying to be cocky. And Cyborg, I don't know, you remember Cyborg's husband back then?
Yeah, eventually. The Cyborg Santos is his name.
He was very offended. And so he's looking at me like I just slapped his wife or something. I mean, he's very offended. And so none of that whole crew liked me at all. Yeah,
you're talking about the early days, and when Americans showed up, to some of these Brazilians, this may have been the first the first taste of international competition after a lot of competition down there and stuff. Yeah, and I remember Evangelista Cyborg. If you look back at that show, you had Alex Stiebling, who won the whole thing and went on to be the Gracie Killer in Pride and stuff like that. I mean, guys like Milton Bahia was there. I knew Milton very well. John Rankin fought, an American veteran who we all, give shout outs to and respect. You had the Pedro. You had definitely a good mix of fighters from the early days there. And what was the whole deal with Venezuela itself there? Because now, it's in the news and stuff like that. And back then, people say it was a stable country. But I remember hearing some stories. Like, I remember Alex Stiebling told me he was, and two police officers came in and asked him to get off the plane. And, after he won the tournament and stuff, he'd been, partying and going out with girls and doing stuff like that. And he said to myself, oh, my God, somebody must have put something in my bag. He goes out real scared, and they made him take his belt out so they could take pictures with him. That's what they delayed the trip for. So crazy stuff. Tell me, go ahead, go shoot.
It got real crazy, Miguel. Anyway, so I got in trouble. I'm the one that got John Rankin on that card. They needed one more guy, and it was like a day and I was already in Venezuela, and they said, "Do you know anybody?" And so I was just thinking, hey, I had this buddy back in the States, so I got him to call John Rankin. Well, Phyllis Lee got mad at me because she wanted one of her fighters to do it, and she didn't like Rankin for whatever reason. But yeah, Caracas, we get there and they say, do not leave the hotel after dark, guys. Y'all stay in the hotel. Well, we listened to it as much as we could, but they didn't fly us out the day after the fight. We had another day there, and then they flied us out. So the next night, we didn't have anything to do. So we're all young guys, right? I don't want to say any names, but we're all out partying, and some powder starts being circulated. Well, I've got this Venezuelan girl with me that I'm talking. She can't speak any English. The only English she can say is "No, John." Right? I come to find out. But anyway, other than that, she's very friendly. So we're talking, and then somebody in the group was getting powder, right, from out in the parking lot. Well, they seen all this money that the guy had, so they tried to kidnap him and drive out of the parking lot with him. He dives out of the back seat of the car. We get back to the hotel, and I had brought my friend that I had met to the hotel with me. And so me and her are in the room being friendly. And I remember our flight had to leave out for all of us Americans. So all the Americans early in the morning, they're like calling my room. They're all in the lobby with Phyllis Lee, bless her heart. They're all in the lobby calling my room. Ivy, come on. Well, I was still being friendly. Right. And so anyway, I'm trying to get done being friendly, Miguel. And I get done. I throw my clothes in my bag. I was like, okay, I'm coming. Click. The elevator goes down to the lobby because we're going to be late for the airplane. And everybody's looking at me when the doors open. They're all looking at me like, you son of a, right? And then she walks out behind me, and she was a knockout, Miguel. You'd be proud of your boy. They all seen her, and they started clapping. So Ivy came through in the clutch, man. But, yeah, that was a crazy trip.
Well, you know, if you didn't win the belt, that may be a good consolation prize,
Right.
you know, and the Venezuelans, you know, I don't know, but in my lifetime, a high percentage of women that have won Miss Universe have been from Venezuela. So beautiful girls for sure. So yeah, and that is the old school. And the powder walking around, parties, and now you're in Venezuela. That's a whole different thing. Some guys will dabble, some guys won't dabble. We won't get into that or any details with those people, but at some point you do got to realize too, you're close to the source for that shit. You're in a dangerous situation there. You know what I mean? Now you look back now you look back at it with your daughter, and now you're a smart, man of the world kind of thing. You probably wouldn't be caught dead around some shit like that. But in those days, you're kind of crazy, and it's like, hey, yeah, we're partying in Venezuela, and yeah, I've seen things go off the rails before. Put it that way.
It could have got real bad real fast, Miguel. If I was there today and had the chance to redo it, I would have stayed in the room and watched Venezuelan TV that night.
So definitely now let's close out the show with that, because definitely that Venezuela IVC, November 11, 2001. Now you're delving into the old school, and in such a way that Zuffa had just purchased the UFC, but they weren't the force that they were going to be. So the IVC and this show was one that Alex Steidlin used to parlay into an extended career and an extended run in Japan, where he hopefully banks some money and stuff. I'm sure Alex is working nowadays and not retired off his MMA winnings anyway. But at the end of the day, it was definitely a historic show. And we mentioned the Ben Rothwell show. Why don't you go ahead and those are some of my memories too. Why don't you go ahead and give us one from your memory banks? It doesn't have to be on my show or anything like that, but one that you remember that you want people to know from the old school. Hey, I fought this guy, or this happened. I fought. There's got to be more. I know you, Jonathan.
Well, my record, people say things about my record, but my fights with Ken Shamrock, Dan Severin, Rico Rodriguez, Travis View, I think it's 27 UFC veterans I fought. All those that I just mentioned, they were all judges' decisions, right? So I wasn't an easy out for anybody once I started learning what MMA was, and I kind of knew the ins and outs of things. So I wasn't an easy out, but I got a call. My first call, like, I'm going to make it, right, was against Dan Severin up in Boston. They called me, and I went up there, and I was feeling like, okay, I've made it. I'm fixing to show that I can beat these guys that people have heard of. And I was feeling all big and like, okay, I was the main event. And they pick us up from the airport, and they take us to the motel, and it was just this little really bad motel. And I check in my room, and there's a used condom laying on the floor in my room, and it all just hit me at once that, Ivy, you ain't made nothing, bro. You're the same guy you've always been. And because but Severin ended up beating me by judge's decision. But he's one of those guys you were talking about. Afterwards, we sat there and talked, and he tried to he gave me advice on things I was doing wrong and things like that. So, but man, just when I thought,
the truth is, the record aside, but you got a lot in common with Dan, because Dan was definitely a pioneer and a guy who would be like, all right, what's my calendar like? Evansville, I'll fight in Evansville on Tuesday, and then Saturday I'll hit, Cincinnati or Detroit. He was a guy who never said no, wasn't shy about a fight, and a guy you could model yourself after, and a guy like yourself who throughout all the rigors really stayed healthy. Did you have any injuries that you suffered, like anything big time? I don't recall during our state. That's a blessing if that's the case.
I only had one. We were talking about Dave Strasser earlier. He used to run a show up in Wisconsin. He brought me up there, and he said I was going to fight a guy that was 6 foot 315. Right. Well, I get there, and the guy's not at the rules meeting.
I remember that Adonis was his name or something like that.
Adonis Nunn, right?
Yeah.
Well, guess what, Miguel? He wasn't 6'3", 315. He was about 6'8", about 400 and something. So he walks in. Well, I tried to do a rolling knee bar because I'm not very bright, right? And so he just dropped all of his weight down, and I was like, it was like an accordion or whatever that thing is those guys play. But my back just, so I had to drive from I rode from Wisconsin to Tennessee, laying on the floor of a van, because I didn't have insurance or anything like that. And I laid up in bed for, it felt like weeks. I didn't know if my back was broke or what, but that's the only time I've ever been severely. I've had broke hands and things like that, but the only time where I couldn't keep fighting and hide it from a promoter and still do a fight was whenever my back was messed up from that Adonis Nunn fight.
Man, and Adonis Nunn, you're talking about a guy that, really wasn't an athlete. Was really a bouncer, kind of, tough guy and things. But first of all, Jonathan Ivey is a massive man. Always has been. And, now you're looking even more, you're trim and stuff, but you're still a weightlifter, and you're a massive man. Adonis Nunn could look twice your size, man. This guy was insanely huge. And have him fall on your back and hurt you gives you an idea of how big that is. Because if I fell on your back, you would just be like, because you're a strong man. So that's crazy. And I do know who Adonis Nunn is. And yeah, Strasser thought he had a super heavyweight phenom there. But Adonis, I don't think he had Adonis didn't have the discipline, because at the end of the day, this sport does take discipline. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll sign off, give you time to go about the rest of your day, Jonathan. And I appreciate it a great deal. This has been so much fun.
Yeah. Well, I always fought heavyweight or super heavy. I didn't care. It was whatever the promoter wanted to pay me to fight. And really, I should have probably been fighting light heavyweight or middleweight. But I always had the attitude where I didn't want to hide from people. I felt like if I had to cut weight, that I was hiding from these other guys. And so I didn't want to hide from anybody. So I wanted to fight whoever they wanted me to fight. Now looking at it, that's probably a lack of discipline. That was probably just an excuse for me, a macho way of me trying not to have discipline and actually get some of this fat off and weight off. But real quick, Miguel, before we close, you mentioned that the Ben Rothwell fight. Mikey Burnett was at that fight, and so was Dana White and other people, Chuck Liddell. But Mikey Burnett was there, and we rode together. Mikey was a real crazy guy, but he said if I would have came along, a couple years earlier than I did, that I would have been Tank Abbott. And so I feel like, it's just a bunch of it's timing, and a bunch of it is just, the decisions you make. But I'm happy with the way it went, man. It could have went a lot worse. You giving me a shot has been able to give me a career and a way to, now I host my own events, and I do Leglock seminars, and I referee, and I'm still currently fighting. So you gave me that opportunity, man, because otherwise the way I came up, it wasn't going to be a happy ending for me, man. I really appreciate it.
And I appreciate the kind words and stuff like that. All I did was have the stage, but it was you who performed on it, and it's you who's kept it going and stuff. So you deserve all the credit. And I just want to give a shout out to Jonathan's YouTube channel, Jonathan Ivey. Go ahead and check it out. Some of the stuff out on there is downright hilarious. And he's got a great personality. He's got a great core of friends there that are helping him do that. They got retros on his old fights where they talk about fighting and stuff like that. They also do some movie reviews on. Jonathan is one of the foremost experts on horror movies. So they have a lot of fun. Particularly me now, I'm kind of crazy from the old days, but now I got an 8-year-old. So I like to see, your videos with your daughter too.
Yeah.
Because, it gives you a nice human touch and stuff. So definitely give some support to Jonathan. Go ahead and like his channel. And we're definitely going to have him back. Next time there's heavyweights in the UFC, we'll be talking and doing picks, okay?
Thank you, Miguel. I really appreciate you, brother.
All right. Love you, bro. Go ahead, take it easy. It's 11 o'clock your time. Go to your appointment, and this will be up shortly. I'll send you some links.
Thank you, brother.
Bye-bye to everyone out there.